Hi, I'm Modigan, and this is an overview of MQ2EmuCharacters. If you haven't used it before, it's comparable to the HUD plugin, but it's graphical, and each element on the HUD automatically functions within the context of each character that you have loaded in NetBots. That'll make sense in a second, I promise. Here I have 4 characters all logged in. All of them have NetBots enabled with grab and send turned on. I've copied the EmuCharacters user interface files over to the EverQuest directory, and I've loaded MQ2EmuCharacters, but other than that, I haven't set the plugin up at all. Now, each of the buttons on these displays are contextualized to the character that they represent, and it does that automatically. So this hit point bar here represents this characters, and the buttons below it will affect just that character. And if I loaded a new character into NetBots, one that I've never used before, it would have its own pod group pop up instantly, and it would already be loaded with the correct buttons and displays. So if I tell this first character to sit, he's right here. If I tell him to sit, he will sit. If I click this monitor icon, it will swap to his display. If I click this foot icon, he will follow me. And if I click the stop sign, he will stop. But it's not just about command and control. You can also see information. You can display things. There's the obvious stuff like hit points, but you can display any information that's available to MacroQuest, any NetBots information. So if I hover over this guy's buffs, you can see how much time is left on the buff. And if I click him, it will send a remote command to that character to click that buff off. Now each of these pod groups, each of these characters' little window are customizable. You can change the default, which will affect everyone. You can change the archetype, like you could change the default for healers or casters, and that'll override the overall default. You can customize it for class. So like if you want your clerics to show a mana bar instead of a stamina bar, you could do that, and that would override the archetype. And at the last layer, you've got the character-specific overrides, which would override any default. So, for example, if you wanted your tank to have a special hotkey that just he had, you could do that. At a high level, you can do that by this icon in the lower right corner. If I click that, it puts us in arrange mode. That gives us quick access to some of the settings, such as what direction we want to tile in. So that has us tile horizontal. And this is a good point to show you the wrapping. If you have too many characters spamming across the screen and they're going to fall off the edge, they will actually wrap to the next row. And if you're in the vertical layout, they'll wrap to the next column. So while you're in this arrange mode, let's get back to it. While you're in this arrange mode, you can move the pod groups up and down. I'm going to do this in vertical. It's a little easier to see. So if I hover over one of these, you can see this blue arrow in the middle. That will move that whole character's pod group up. So this green one is me. Your name always shows up in green. So if I click this blue up arrow, it'll put me as the top pod. And that order will save indefinitely. You can edit that in the INI file, or by just clicking the blue arrow a few times on your other characters. We can also move, it's hard to tell, but these, the area where the buffs are, the area where the buttons are, and the area where the hit points are actually separate little elements. That's why they're highlighting buttons separately. So these up and down arrows on the left will move that section up and down. The plus button will add a new element, and the X button will remove a new element. Let's take this paladin, for example. He's showing a stamina bar right now, but say I wanted to show a mana bar instead. Well, I could hover over it and click the plus button. That will open the gallery. This displays all the objects that we have installed in our version of MacroQuest, or all the objects that we've created. Here, and you can see they're specific to this character, so they're already populated. So that red hit point bar there, that's actually what his hit points are at right now. This is the one we want here, and there's multiple pages. but this is the caster one we want. That has the blue monobar, so I'll click that. And you'll see that it adds it right there. But we still have the stamina bar, so we can hover over it and click X, and that will remove it. And that pretty much sets that character up the way I want it. But there's also a header and footer pod group where you can place displays or buttons that aren't related to a specific character, or buttons that you want to affect every character. The footer is the area down here. It has a little, that green light shows you that the plugin is enabled and that you have NetBots turned on and everything like that. If you didn't, that would show up red. And then here's the header up here. That's what the title bar is, and you can click that to drag it just like a regular window. There's also a minimize button that'll collapse the plugin down to just the title bar, or to just the header. But let's say we wanted to add some buttons to the header that would affect every character. Well, obviously that wouldn't be fitting to put on a characters pod, so we'll put that in the header by clicking this plus button. And now you can see this is not character specific anymore. This is for the header. And we have these buttons dash all here. If we click that, it'll add those buttons. They're above the title bar right now, which doesn't look very good. So we'll hover over them. We'll click the down arrow. And now it looks exactly the way we want it to look. So we can click this exit button here, or I can just click escape. And I'll do that now. So now that we have this this all set of buttons on, we can click the down arrow, which will make everyone sit. And you can see everyone sits, everyone stands, everyone follows, and etc. Now that gallery that we had open, I said you could customize those objects and create your own objects. We'll go and look at the stamina bar here, the one that we removed. If you go to your MacroQuest directory, and then you open the objects folder, these are all the objects that are available to us. And you can make your own, and they'll automatically show up in that gallery. The one with the yellow bar that we removed is this character.ini. Now each one of these little chunks is an element that displays in that pod. So this bar.1 is the hit point bar. This bar.2 is the stamina bar. And you could add another object by just giving it a new name, bar5.percent, bar5.top. You just start adding settings for an object, and that program will assume that you want to create a new object. Let's look at the hit point bar here. You can see on this, we've set its percent, its color, what happens when you click it, the tooltip color, the top and left corner of it, and the height and width of it. And you can see the percent is coming from the NetBots percent hit points property. And that's also being used to display the numerical percent on the tooltip pop-up. The really interesting one here is the on-click. When you click the on-click, it will parse this command as a variable, and then it will execute it. So this character variable here, this is the context part. So normally you would have a character's name there, like Modigan. But we want this to work for every character. So instead, you replace the character's name with this character variable. And when this object loads, it parses through the whole object, and it replaces that variable with the character's name that owns the pod that it's on. So if this was on Modigan's pod, all those character variables will be replaced with the word Modigan. And then everything will automatically affect Modigan. The hit point displays will come from Modigan, etc. You can see in the hit point display here, it has that same character variable. Now, that's not the only context variable. We have variables for Shift, Alt, and Control that determine if the Shift, Alt, or Control keys are pressed. So you could, for example, when you click this, if you Shift clicked it, you could have it do a heal over time. And if you don't have Shift held down, it would do a complete heal. There are context variables for class. There's even some more exotic context variables for where this element appears on the screen. So you could actually have it behave differently when it's in the header or the footer or, on a character or whatever. Now, this all looks pretty complicated. It's a whole lot of stuff to configure. But what you can do is create a new object and tell it to behave just like an existing object, but with a minor tweak that you want. If you're a coder, that means that these objects have inheritance. So if you remember the caster pod that I added to my paladin earlier, the one with the blue monobar, I replaced this character pod with that. So let's open that caster version. And this looks a lot simpler. This is what the settings for it look like. And the top two, the top one is the name of it, and the second line is the description. This description is what will show up in the gallery. The third line here is the important one. This tells it to inherit all the behaviors of the character object. This is the character object here. So, for example, this bar 1, which is the hit point bar, even though we don't reference bar 1 in this caster object, it'll inherit it from that caster object. So if we just had these top 3 lines, it would behave exactly the same as the character object, which isn't very helpful. So that's where these bottom 4 lines come in. They're referencing bar 2, which if we go back to the character, you can see bar 2 is the stamina bar. Back to the caster, we're telling it to, instead of display stamina, display mana. Instead of it being blue, we want you to be red. And we want it to display the numeric value for the mana in the tooltip, and we want to change the tooltip color. But you notice we don't have the top, the left, or the height, or the width. It's because we want to inherit those values from the stamina bar, which are right here. So, you can, like I said, create an object, tell it to copy an old one, and then just change what happens when you click the button, or something like that. And you can also add new objects. So I could come down here and add bar pet dot %. And then I could put in the macro request variable to fetch this character's pet's life percentage and display that. So you can override existing elements and you can add new elements. And there's other objects out there that are already set up for you to do that. If we go and look, we have this buttons object, and you can see it's got 10 buttons in here, and they're all placed in a grid, and the on-click and the tooltips are blank. That's because this is meant for you to inherit from. So let's open the buttons all. You can see this inherits from that buttons thing, and all it does is set the on-click and the tooltips. And then we have a different set of buttons. So you could inherit and create a new object called buttons cleric and set all your heal spells up on it, or whatever it is you wanted for your cleric. It seems like a lot, but it's actually pretty simple. I think that's probably a pretty good overview. I could probably go on about this for a couple hours. I'll cut it off here, and if you have questions, you can hit the forums. And if you want to see the documentation, if you go to the forums, you have the software and documentation forum, and there's a post called MQ2EmuCharacters version 2. And if you go to that, there's an index, and it will show you all the properties for the object files, and all the commands and top-level objects and context variables and everything you need to know. It's pretty extensive, and it's got a table of contexts, so it's fairly easy to navigate. So if you have any questions, hit up the forums, and thanks for watching.